Hello and welcome to Skills in Automation. My name is Ash and today we're going to look at 5 ways to find the last row of a range of data, and I'll include one bonus technique as well. Here are the 5 techniques that we're going to go through and a bonus topic as well. The fact that there are 5 plus 1 ways may cause some confusion when it comes to choosing the right technique to find the last row. From my perspective at least, the answer lies in how our data is laid out and the convenience of the technique in consideration. In this video, we'll go through each technique on a high level and I will explain my preferences as we move along. We'll also look at a comparison chart at the end. And on a side note here, I've published separate videos on each technique where we deep dive and perform some common tasks after finding the last row using that method. Please do check those out as well. Before we begin coding, I just want to mention that throughout this video, I will refer to the worksheet using the worksheet code name. So instead of going this workbook.sheets and the worksheet name, we can directly refer to the worksheet using just its code name. And the code name can be found in the properties menu out here. There are many benefits to this, but we won't get into it now. Okay, moving on. Every technique that we're going to cover here can be performed physically in Excel as well. So what we'll do is first perform the task in Excel and then check out how to do the exact same thing through VBA code. First up, we'll look at the Ctrl plus arrow shortcut key in Excel. If you're a moderate to heavy Excel user, then this shortcut would be used almost as second nature to navigate through data on our Excel sheet. To go to the bottom row, we start from the first row with data, which happens to be in the first row in Excel, and hit the Ctrl plus down arrow. This will take us to the last row with data. This is fine to do if there is data on the sheet, but what if there is no data or if we just have the header? Now, if we hit Ctrl down, we go to the very last row in Excel. Now that's not what we want. To counter this, we can actually start from the bottom and do Ctrl up. This will take us to the last used row with data in it, or back up to the first row if there is no data, or if just the top row has data. Let's try that again with data in it. So we're at the bottom, Ctrl up, and we come to row number 12, which is the last used row. And what if there is no data? Start from the bottom row, Ctrl up, we come back to the top row. Let's head on over to the VB editor and do this through code. Let's hit Alt F11 to go to the VB editor. First, we'll declare a variable to hold the last row number and print out the result. Now let's build the code. The Ctrl up or down method only works in single columns. So we are going to search in column A. We need to feed in the very last row number, which can be found using rows.count. Now for the VBA equivalent of the Ctrl and arrow key, we will use the end property. There are 4 options here. We are going up, so we will choose Excel up. And lastly, to grab the row number, we will use the row property. Okay, let's run this and see what we get. We get 12, which is the right answer. This is by far my favorite technique to grab the last row number. You will see me using it in most of my videos. 2 drawbacks here are that you are only searching within the one column, and secondly, the last row for one column may not be the same as the last row for other columns within the same data set. For example, the last row as per column A is row 9, but the last row for the data set is row 12. So if we just looked in column A, we would assume that row 9 is the last used row, but that would be incorrect. But this code is short and intuitive. And as long as you know your data well and know where the non-blank columns are, then this technique is safe to use. The current region of a data set is the entire region of data that is surrounded by blank rows and blank columns. And we can determine the current region by selecting any cell in the data and pressing Ctrl A. But let's put in a blank row in between a data set. Now let's try and select the current region again. Ctrl A. We can see that these 3 lines of data don't get picked up, and that's because there's a blank row separating it from the main data set. So as long as your data set contains continuous rows and continuous columns, you can safely use the current region property to find the last row. And even if there is a column with blank data, as long as there is a header, it will get picked up in the current region. Just press Ctrl A out here. So our entire data still gets selected. Let's check out the code for this in a VB editor. Alt F11. If your data starts from row 1, then we can just count the number of rows in the data set, and that will be equal to the last row used by that data set in Excel. So this data set has 12 rows of data in it, and the last used row in our Excel sheet is row 12 as well. We can choose a current region from any cell within the data set. Let's select current region, and we want to count the number of rows in it, which is rows.count. I use this technique quite often as well. But if your data doesn't start from the first row, then we need to do this the proper way. That is by getting the row number of the last row using the index number of that row. So suppose our data set starts from row 3. Let's find the last row using the same technique. And just note here, I've changed the cell to A3 because the data set starts from the third row. Run this, we still get 12, but our last row now is 14. So what we will do is just copy this part, park it below for just a moment. Now we need to feed in the row index, which is nothing but the count of rows in the data set. And let's grab the row. Delete this off. Let's run this and see what we get. Now we get 14, which is the right answer. This looks more complex. To simplify it, we could assign the current region to a range object. So let's declare a range variable and we'll assign it to the current region. And now that's done, we can just replace this code with a range object and this code with the range object as well. Let's run this. 14, correct answer. But what if our data set is separated by blank rows? Or rather, you're not even sure whether your data set is separated by blank rows or not. We can then use the used range property of the worksheet object to grab the last row. If your data starts from row 1, then similar to the current region, we can just count the number of rows within the used range. And just count the number of rows. Let's run this. We get 14, which is the right answer. But if our data set doesn't start from row 1, or we're not sure whether it starts from row 1, then again, similar to current region, we need to get the row number of the last row using the index number of that row. Let's copy this, park it below, feed in the index number, which is the count of the rows in the range, and we want to grab the row. Let's run this. We get 16, which is the right answer. Before we move on, we need to note one thing about use range. It doesn't only look for values such as text or number within the cell. It will also look for formulas and formatting. So let's color these cells yellow. Let's run this code again. This time our last row is 19. And that's because this formatting extends till row 19. Similarly, if you had formulas extending all the way down below, in fact, let's do that. Let's just do equal to blank. Drag these formulas down. Let's run this code again. So this time our last row is 27, and that's because the 27th row contains a formula in it. So that's just something to note, that if you use used range, you're going to pick up formulas and formatting as well. Depending on what outcome you're after, that may or may not be what you want. Okay, moving on. Excel is a menu full of options called Go to Special that allows us to select cells with special characteristics. Let's check it out. In the Home ribbon, go to Find and Select, then select Go to Special. We can see a list of options here. For now, we're only interested in the last cell. Click OK, and the last used cell in our worksheet will be selected. And just for fun, let's do this via shortcuts. Press Ctrl G, and then Alt S to go to the special options. Alt S again to select this last cell, and enter. Similar to use range, the advantage of using special cells is even if our data range has blank cells or blank rows or blank columns, we will still be able to locate the last used cell. And similar to use range, if the cell doesn't have any values, but there is a formula or formatting in it, the special cells technique will still consider it as a used cell. And depending on what outcome you're after, this may or may not be what you want. Let's do this through code. Alt F11. We can call the last cell option of the special cells method from any cell, and it will give the same answer. Choose the special cells method. You can see our options. We are interested in the last cell, and we want to grab the row of the last cell. Let's run this. We get 14, which is the right answer. Personally, I've never used this technique. It yields the same result as use range, but there is one issue. If you update the data and try to run special cells without saving the changes in the workbook, special cells will still determine the use range based on the previous version of data. Let's try it out. Okay, so I've added one new line of data out here. Let's run this code. Our last row is 16, which is the right answer. So now what I'm going to do is delete this row. So any trace of that data has been deleted. I'm not going to save this workbook yet. What we can do is run this code again. The answer we get is still 16. But now the last row is actually row 14, which means special cells did not get updated. Let's save this workbook. Run this code again. This time we get 14, which is the right answer. We don't face this issue with the use range property. Let's compare special cells and use range side by side. So we're going to do the same thing. We have a new row of data out here. Let's run this code. Okay. So the last row as per special cells is 16 and the last row as per the use range is 16, and both are correct. Now let's delete this line of data and let's run this code again. Special cells, as what we saw last time, still shows row 16 as the last use row, while use range has obviously updated because it's showing the last row as row 14, which is the correct answer. So clearly special cells technique is lagging. So that's just something to be mindful of. Moving on to the next technique. This is the most efficient technique of finding the last row, but the code is long-winded and I seldom use it unless the situation calls for it. And I'll explain what that situation is in a bit. For now, let's head on over to our home ribbon, find and select, and find, or we can just go Ctrl F. We have 5 options here, which we can even specify through code, but there are even more options available in VBA, and some of them will help us find the last row. Let's go to our VBA editor. I'm just going to paste in the code with the find options, but with blank values, and we'll fill them up as we go. So in VBA, there are 9 find options in total. We will specify 7. First up is find what. We are looking for all values, text or number. So we will just specify an asterisk. Next, we want to start the search from the very first cell, which is range A1. For lookin, we have 2 options. If you just want to search for cells with values in them, then choose values. If you want to look for values or formulas, then choose formulas. This is really important. I already have worksheet.useRange to look for formulas and formatting, and I have range.end to look for values. Then why would I use find? I would use it only when I want to look for values in a data range that may be separated by blank rows. I am saying I here because this is completely a personal preference. You could actually use find in every instance if you wanted, and that's fine as well. Next up, we will choose whether we want to look in part of the cell or all of it. We'll go with part, but for last row, it really doesn't matter. Search order will depend on what you're looking for. We are looking for the last row, so we want to search by rows. Search direction is our most important selection. We can start our search forwards by looking in the next cell, or go backwards by looking in the previous one and the one after that. If we choose next, we will simply land up in cell B1 because it's the next used cell, but that's not what we want. So starting from range A1, we will select previous, which will take us to the very last cell in Excel, and we will start our search backwards by looking at each row till the very end, and the next row after that, and the row after that, till we come to row 12, and keep looking till we find a value in row 12 and column J. Match case doesn't really matter because we're looking for a wildcard. We can just go with false. Okay, let's run this and see what we get. We get row 12, which is the right answer. Now suppose there is some formatting out here. Let's run this code again. We still get row 12. So the formatting is being ignored. But there is one issue. If there is no data, then the range.find will throw a runtime error. To counter that, we will need to add in some error handling. If there is no data, we will skip the find method and go to the next line of code. In this case, the last row variable will not get populated. And if it remains undefined as 0, we will return the last row as row 1. So put in the error handling here. What this says is if any line of code after this statement has an error, it will ignore that line of code and jump to the next line. And in the next line, we'll put in some logic. If this line of code errors out, this variable will retain its default value, which is 0, and we'll reset it to 1. Let's blank out this data. First, I'm just going to comment the error handling out. Let's run this and see what we get. So we get the runtime error, which is what we were expecting. Now let's comment out the error handling, run the code again, and this time we get the answer 1. And it's completely up to you. If there is no data, I would like the last row to be returned as 1, but you could return the last row as 0 if that's what you're after. And that's the full code to just find the last row using the find method. Quite a handful, isn't it? And that's exactly why I use range.end or range.currentRegion, because they are both just one line of code. And I leave find aside until it's absolutely necessary to use it. A common use case of when I would definitely use find is if the data sheet has been manually filled out by a user. I wouldn't be too confident about the data set. That is, I wouldn't know whether there are blank rows or blank columns in it, whether there is any extra formatting or extra formulas. In that case, the safest method to use would be the find method. Okay, moving on to our bonus technique. Tables are awesome, and I would highly recommend to use them whenever you can. And finding the last row is straightforward as well. Let's check out how to do it. We'll start by creating a table. Select any cell in your dataset, go to Insert, Table. Yes, I'll keep this option selected because my table has headers. Click OK, and we can come to Table Design and give this table a name. And the shortcut for creating a table is just Ctrl+T. Okay, let's open our VBA editor. In VBA, table is referred to as a list object. So let's declare a list object variable and assign a table to it. And since this is an object variable, we will need to set it. And we just need to add in the table name. So the same logic as current region. If the first row of table is the same as the first row of the Excel worksheet, then we can just count the number of rows in the table, and that will be equal to the last row in the Excel worksheet. And we'll count the number of rows in the range, which includes the table header. Let's run this. We get 12, which is the right answer. But if the table doesn't start from row 1, then we need to grab the row number of the last row using its index number. Exact same logic as what we did in current region and use range. We'll just copy this, park it below, feed in the row index, and grab the row. Let's add in a few blanks. Run this code. We get 15, which is the right answer. Pretty much the same logic as in current region or use range. And that is why I love using it as well. The message that I want to communicate here is try and organize your data in tables wherever possible. It makes performing so many operations very straightforward. And not to mention, finding the last row is easy as well. And that's it for all the different ways to find the last used row in our Excel worksheet. We will wrap up by going through which technique I use and when. So disclaimer here is that these are just my preferences, which are based on many factors such as convenience and readability of data. So my first choice is by far range.end. The code is simple and intuitive because it's the exact same as control up in Excel. Here, the assumption is that we need to be sure which column to search the last row in. If I'm pulling the data from a data source such as an SQL database, or I'm creating it myself through code, I'm generally confident which columns will not have blanks. But sometimes if I have more tasks to do with a range, such as copy it or transfer it into an array, I will use the current region technique over range.end. The obvious flaw here is that it won't work if there are blank rows in the data range. This is not a common scenario with my data sets, but if that were the case, I would use worksheet.useRange. And as for special cells, I have never really used it to find the last row. So one characteristic of the worksheet.useRange or special cells is that they consider formatting and formulas as use cells. But what if I want to find the last cell or row with some text or number in it, and the dataset has blank rows as well? Then I would use the find method. And even if the dataset has been manually populated by a different user, in that case, I would return to the find method as well. So generally, I would use it when I'm not really confident of the dataset. And that's my list of preferences and my rationale behind them. In a nutshell though, in my videos, you'll always see me using range.end and range.currentRegion unless the dataset is a bit weird. And that's it for the various ways on finding the last row. I have individual videos where we deep dive into each of the techniques shown here. Please do check those out as well. And if you found this video useful, please like and subscribe. Thanks, and see you in the next one.